All right, welcome everybody. I hope everybody has a great day today. My name is Keenan. I'm with the City of Albany Recreation and Community Services Department. We tend to host a lot of different events as well as topics, and we love to partner with great individuals as groups. And with us today is definitely one of those. So I would love to pass it over to Beth to talk about the Berkeley Garden Club.
Hi, I'm Beth Feingold. I'm a past president, past board member of the Garden Club, and this has been one of the fun things we've been doing for several years now. Switching to Zoom because we started it about 4 minutes before the COVID lockdown. But there's lots of upsides to doing it in the evening and doing it via Zoom. So we are a local garden club. We are almost 100 years old, and we range with gardeners from the ridiculous to the sublime. I'm on the ridiculous end. We may have some of our sublime members out there in the audience today. We invite you to check us out. We have wonderful monthly meetings as well as joining this sort of thing. We have interesting speakers every month, and we have wonderful things like apple tastings in the fall and tomato tastings in the spring, or I guess early summer. And we're kind of an interesting group of people from all over the East Bay. So don't think that you need to live in Berkeley. And I will put a link to our website in the chat, and Keenan will put a link to the Albany Community Center in the chat. And I want to give a shout out to the Albany Community Foundation, who has graciously supported the last series of talks. So I'm going to turn it over to another one of our board members, Patricia, who will introduce our speaker. And thank you everybody for showing up.
Yeah, it's great. I find with these talks, the people that sign up and show up are vitally interested in the topic. So it's great that you're all here. And at the end, I'll tell you about a garden tour that the Berkeley Garden Club is helping put on. But
and we'll put a link to that in the chat. As well.
Yeah, that's right. And it'll be, yeah. So Boegel, Elizabeth Boegel, is a professor at Merritt College, which is a fabulous college. I think one of the best community colleges, particularly for the areas of natural history, sustainability, and landscape horticulture. I think it's the best west of the Mississippi. And Elizabeth received her BA in environmental studies at CSU East Bay, formerly known as Hayward State, and is certified in both landscape horticulture and nursery management through Merritt. So just a broad range of experience. And she's an urban farmer, growing food for family, restoring the soil and ecosystem, and raising chickens and honeybees in suburban Walnut Creek. She's a mom of 2 college-age kids, an avid hiker and naturalist, and harbors a secret desire to walk the Pacific Coast Trail, which is mostly under snow right now. If only she convinced her husband to join her. I have a feeling someday you will. So let me give you the floor, Elizabeth, and we're so glad you're here with us tonight.
Oh, thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I don't know about hiking the PCT this year, but that is a secret, not so secret dream of mine. I'm coming to you from my son's bedroom. He's away at college. And I just have to give a little disclaimer to my very needy cat who's outside the door crying piteously to come in. So I'm sorry if you hear her. I want to thank you, Patricia and Beth, for having me, and Keenan, thank you for all of your help. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight after a beautiful sunny day to discuss one of my favorite topics of all time, resilience. And I think this is a particularly relevant topic after the winter and early spring that we've had this year. I think it's just been crazy. I was actually just watching the weather on the news, and they were talking about that we have had, I thought we had 13, but we have apparently had 17 atmospheric rivers, which is
Wow.
Something, yeah. And while it's great to have all of that precipitation, we've seen the problems that can come from having that much that quickly. Landslides and flooding and people displaced. And all of this came on the heels of the worst 3-year drought in the history of record keeping in California. And that, coupled with the wind and the rain, have brought down thousands upon thousands of mature trees. And I don't think it's over yet, because I'm thinking about the summer that's to come. I'm thinking about the issues that we have yet to face this year, things like snowmelt and flooding. I think about the fact that we have so much more vegetation because of all this rain. When it becomes hot and dry, are we going to have more fire? And there's really no way to know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, we do know that extremes are going to become more extreme, and we have ideas about what will happen, but we don't know exactly when or how much or how badly. And I think we all sort of have this like garden whiplash because of all of these events. And that's related to what we're going to talk about tonight, how we can use our landscapes to increase resilience in our lives personally, and in our communities locally, and maybe even for our planet globally in the face of all this whiplash. But before we start on that, Patricia gave a really lovely intro. May I share my screen, Keenan? Is that okay?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, let's see. All right. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? I think so.
Yes.
All right, great. Firstly, who am I? Patricia said a little bit, but I want to say a little more. I am a mom of 2 college-age kids. I'm a wife. I'm also an urban farmer. I've gardened all my life. I grew up with a dad who had a huge vegetable patch in suburbia and a mother who loved flowers. And I've always had something growing, even when I lived in apartments and I had no space. But about 16 years ago, in this current property, I decided to dedicate most of my growing space to food production. When we moved to this lot, it's about 7,000 square feet in an old part of Walnut Creek, South Walnut Creek. When we moved here 19 years ago, the weeds were as high as my head, and the property was surrounded with chain link, and there were privets. But we had a toddler and an infant, and we mowed all those weeds down and we put up a play structure and we called it perfect. But I kept squirreling away little corners of the garden for my own whims. So I had an affair with native plant gardening. And so after we put in a new wooden fence, all of the borders next to the fence became natives. And then I fell into this deep obsession with cottage gardening after watching Monty Don in the UK, and I wanted flowers that blew romantically in the breeze. And then I fixated on pollinator gardens, and I was determined as a beekeeper to have something for insects every single day of the year. And none of those obsessions ever really went away. I just kept getting new ones. Can anybody else relate to that? And it wasn't long before I claimed an 8x8 patch of ground and started planting tomatoes and corn and cucumbers and peas. And then pretty soon the kids outgrew the play structure. And so I sheet mulched that side of the yard and put in raised beds and converted the sprinklers to drip and started growing food. And then the trampoline went out of fashion. And so I sheet mulched that side of the yard, and on it went until basically the entire space was covered with this chaotic mess of vegetables and fruit and herbs and flowers. And that's how it's been for about 16 years. Now, I grow food not to sell or as a business, but for my family. I have 4 goals as an urban farmer. I want to provide as much of my family's produce as possible for both fresh eating and preserving for the off season. I want to regenerate the soil and create a safe habitat for any wildlife that either visits or lives on the property. I want to provide my neighbors and friends with food. My neighbors know where the herbs are. They know when the blackberries are ripe. They call and ask if they can come pick apples. And I love that I can help provide that community spirit. And lastly, I believe that the garden should be pretty. I believe that a productive farm can also be beautiful. and a respite for all who enter it. And I think we all know how much our gardens became a respite for us during the pandemic. And a pretty garden becomes a teaching garden. So much teaching happens over the garden fence. If kids and neighbors walk by and they stop to admire the beauty, and then they learn a little bit more about what's going on. I also do a little consulting work from time to time as a garden coach, but my time for that has become extremely limited because I'm also a teacher. And I started teaching at Merritt College in January of 2022, not that long ago. I was hired to head up the urban agroecology program in the Natural History and Sustainability Department. And I teach classes in food systems and food culture, social issues surrounding agriculture, edible landscaping, ecology, all of those related issues. The place where I hold my classes is tucked away at the back of campus, and it was recently reclaimed by this program. It's called the Environmental Center, and it was built, that classroom there was built in 1979 as an example of what a tract home could look like if it was environmentally conscious. That is like solar panels and reclaimed materials and passive heating and cooling. Water catchment. At the time, 1979, it was extremely cutting edge. And it was a very robust program through the 80s. But in the 90s, it was basically abandoned. And the center fell into disrepair. And the program was revived just before the pandemic hit. And we reclaimed the building and the garden, although calling it a garden is a stretch. It is now, but only because my students and I have built it from the ground up using all materials that we found on site and donated seed. It was a trash-strewn, horrible place before we got started. I'm very proud of it. I love my students. I love their enthusiasm. They want to change the world. And I think that's great. I love the history and the scrappiness of the Environmental Center on campus. And these flyers are from all the different classes that I teach. This one that's called Environment 3, Social Issues in Agriculture, I'm teaching this summer. So I had to put that plug in. If you'd like to come be a part of it, just email me. I'll help you sign up. So I'm an urban farmer, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a human in this world during a time of climate crisis. This picture was taken on a day I don't think any one of us will forget, in October of 2020, the orange sky day, when the wildfires turned our skies this smoky orange. I hiked up to our closest open space. It's called Sugarloaf. It's right next to Shell Ridge to take this picture of Mount Diablo. What a wake-up call that day was for the entire Bay Area. And we're living climate change right now, as we saw clearly this past winter. I believe it's the biggest event that our world will ever experience. It's humbling, it's scary, it's complicated, it's messy. And as a person working in the field of environmentalism, it can be quite daunting and frankly, rather depressing. And it's easy to get caught up in the feeling that our actions don't matter. It's too big. But I'm a firm believer that small actions can add up to big change. I've always been a doer. And in this frightening period, the best way I know to cultivate active hope, is to take action. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Taking action by creating resilience in our urban spaces. And hopefully those small ways of creating resilience will add up to a big planetary effect. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and lead into this idea of using our urban spaces to create resilience. Is it possible? And if so, how do we accomplish it? But first, we have to define some things. What do I mean by urban? Do I mean cities? Do I mean suburbs? Do I mean hospitals or community centers or restaurants or schools, local parks? Yes. I mean all of that. Basically, I consider all of that urban. Basically, anything that isn't strictly rural, for our purposes tonight, we're going to call urban. The line between urban and suburban has definitely blurred over the past 50 years. And with commuter sprawl, even our furthest suburbs are now quite urban. National Geographic defines these areas by population and by profession. That is, urban areas are densely populated and people don't generally work in agriculture there. And rural areas are agriculture dominant and have much less population density. Nat Geo also states that the difference between the two is becoming less clear in developed countries with large populations. And as you know, throughout the world, the dominant pattern of migration within countries has been from rural to urban areas, partly because cities are seen as offering greater economic opportunities. So what's clear is that the line between urban and suburban is blurring, but the line between urban and rural is quite clear. So tonight, we're going to call anything that isn't strictly rural, urban. So now that we've defined urban, we need to define resilience. What is it? How would you define it? What words would you use to describe it? If anybody, I'm going to stop for a minute, and if anybody would like to shout out an idea, some words that go along with resilience, a word or two, what do you think it is?
Being able to recover from a disaster or setback, fire, flood.
That is perfection. You just mirrored the Oxford English Dictionary. They define it as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And I think I would define it something like the ability to withstand adversity and bounce back from it. I think we've all had to be especially resilient in the last 3 or 4 years for many reasons. And so we all can feel in our guts what resilience is, and we can think of it, we understand it in our brains. But I think the trick is taking it from a cerebral thing into a practical thing. And practical resilience looks different for all of us. But I would suggest that there are 2 important words to include in our definition, and those are health and flexibility. Health contains, I think, strength and stamina, and flexibility means that we're ready to switch gears at a moment's notice, ready to move quickly if the situation calls for it, agile in body and mind, emotions. I think of soldiers saying, stay frosty, able to change if necessary. There's a lot of change happening now, and it's happening fast. If we get stuck in old ways of thinking or being, we might miss out on the ability to be resilient. We have to be fluid. We have to be able to process things quickly and take a course of action without worry or fear bogging us down. I have a personal motto that I use a lot. I don't know where I learned it or heard it originally, maybe therapy. It's mood follows action. We can feel all kinds of ways about something, but nothing happens until we take action. So there are a lot of times I don't want to do something, but if I just go ahead and do it, I feel better. And I think we have all kinds of fears about the future and anxiety and worry. The best way to combat those feelings is to take action. Resilience requires action. It also requires some other things like mental fortitude and emotional strength, but let's table those for now and let's focus on action and the things that we can do as urban farmers and gardeners to increase resilience in our spaces. So when I say space, what do I mean? This is not my house. This is a picture I got off the internet in the fall or last summer. This house was for sale in Oakland. I think it's easier to consider creating resilience in a larger lot. My lot is about 1/6 of an acre. Probably 1/6 of that is taken up with hardscape. That's not particularly large, but it is large for urban standards. That's generous. So what is a typical lot in Oakland? I'm thinking, I had a cottage in East Oakland for years that had about a 10 by 10 front yard. Maybe the hills have a little more space. So can we create resilience in a yard this size? What about an apartment building? How do you create resilience on a balcony or a patio? How about a rooftop garden? How about that hill strip that lies between the sidewalk and the street? Or how about street trees? Can they be more resilient? I would say yes, yes, yes. All those spaces are an opportunity to create resilience. And I personally, I would call this space not particularly resilient. Now, I want to say that I believe all spaces have the potential to be resilient. Let me just say that from the outset. So I'm just looking at this space as it is right now. I don't think it's particularly resilient. Here are some other spaces I would not call at the moment particularly resilient. This is an empty lot in downtown Concord. Now, there is something about this space that I think is resilient, and that is weeds. These weeds have colonized this space. That's a really good sign. The fact that there are weeds here means that things can happen here. This has a lot of potential, but I would not call it resilient right now. And then this picture on the left, I took in Richmond at a health strip. Again, here's some grass that's grown and colonized here and some mustards. I see inklings of resilience, but long grass has a lot of opportunity for resilience, but short grass doesn't really have that. So I would call this space very possible, but not resilient yet. And this picture on the right was taken on Treasure Island. And there's all this housing, and then there's this, dead grass in the middle doing absolutely nothing for anyone. So I would call that space at the moment not resilient. It might be okay for dogs to run on. That's good. What do you think about this? This is fake grass. I got this picture. I hope there are no kids present. I got this picture off a Twitter account called Shit Lawns. It's in the UK. Fake grass is plastic. It's plastic, it gets hot, it requires cleaning, it requires water for rinsing, it smothers soil life because it doesn't allow for oxygen exchange. It's not resilient at all in any way, shape, or form. Now, what about this? This is in Las Vegas. This one's iffy, right? Drought tolerant, that's good. I worry about shade here. I worry about this AC bill that these people have. I think this is questionable, but I think we can do better than this for resilience. So let's look at about some spaces that I think look resilient. What do you think about this? Does this look resilient to you? It's not neat. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's overgrown, it's abundant. That's my South Side garden in high summer. How about this? This is in Italy. This was an apartment building that was built first and foremost to be a forest for birds and butterflies, and second for people. Now, this is expensive. This is not a cheap fix. This is an expensive proposition. But if we're building all these new housing spaces for people in the Bay Area, why not build them this way and increase our resilience? Or how about this? This is in Germany. This is an old ironworks. And they took it over. Well, nature took it over. And then the community took it over and made it into a public park. And there's community gardens here. There's places to play. There's places to exercise. There's places with natives. I mean, this is the kind of thing I can imagine in all over downtown in the west part of Oakland or along the waterfront. This is incredibly resilient. And how about this? We all know about this place in Manhattan where the old train was on a mile of tracks up above the city. And it was redesigned to be a public park. It's a huge attraction for Manhattan. This is also resilient. These are all clearly resilient spaces. We know it when we see it. A resilient urban space is lush, often overgrown, not clipped or manicured. It's often green, but it doesn't have to be Ireland green. It's alive with creatures. And by creatures, I don't just mean wildlife, I also mean people. We're part of this urban space too. It apparently has healthy soil. It's growing beautiful plants. And it's abundant with resources or food or both. So that's what we're after in our resilient garden spaces: richness and beauty, that lushness and life, that abundance. That's what we're after. So how do we get it? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about these practices that get us that abundance and that resilience. Let's start with the personal resilience with an urban space. These are the things we gain personally by having a resilient urban garden. If we choose to grow food, we increase our food security. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations defines food security as, or says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. Now, attaining true food security is an enormous challenge when you think about our communities. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to local resilience. But if you take that definition from the UN personally, you could say that having food growing right outside your back door means you absolutely have some degree of food security. Seeds are cheap compared to produce. Ron Finley of the Ron Finley Project in Los Angeles says that growing your own food is like printing your own money. I haven't checked to see how much, say, fresh asparagus is in the market right now because I have my own growing. But I can say with confidence that I'm spending about $60 for every bag of groceries I get, regardless of where I go or what I buy. And the economic benefit of planting your own food cannot be overstated. It's especially welcome during times of financial stress, like now with inflation, or during the early days of COVID when we saw so many people going hungry. Now, there is a small amount of money that's required for starting up a garden. Starting small with a few containers and some bagged soil and some seeds is not terribly expensive. And the abundance that comes from those few seeds pays for itself over time. I think this is especially true of something like herbs. You have a recipe that requires a bunch of herbs. You go to the store, you spend, I don't know what, $5-6 on a bunch of herbs, and you use a tablespoon of it, and it ends up going in the compost, the rest of that. But when you grow your own herbs, you can afford to be profligate if you want to. Everything tastes better with your fresh herbs. If we go back to this definition from the FAO about food security, we can see that personally, growing our food in our own yards means we have both physical and economic access to it. It can often provide completely sufficient amounts of what we need or want, especially in the case of something like zucchini. Sometimes it's overabundant. And we know it's safe because we grew it. We know what's gone into the food. We know the provenance of the soil and the seeds. We know that the produce has not been sprayed with pesticides or herbicides. We know if we used fertilizer, hopefully something low nutrient and organic like our own compost or fish emulsion. We know it's nutritious because we're not growing Cheetos out the back door. We're growing vegetables and fruits, which contain the nutrients we need to be healthy. And we can take this a step further by preserving some of our harvest for the off season. Preserving food takes a certain amount of dedication and time, I admit that, but it is so worth it to pull a bag of frozen blueberries out of your freezer on Christmas morning for pancakes, or brighten up those really rainy February days by opening a jar of tomatoes that were canned in the height of summer that smell that rich summer scent. And nothing improves our health as much as eating our own fermented foods. And you can ferment practically anything you grow in the garden easily. I also put a dehydrator one year on my Christmas list. And with that thing, I can dry so many things. I mainly use it for chilies. I make all of our own spice blends, smoked paprika, things like that. You smoke them on the smoker first, and then you dry them, and then you grind them. It's out of this world. But you don't need a dehydrator. You can hang herbs from the ceiling, and I do that from our homemade drying racks. When the oregano is abundant, I cut it down and I bring it inside and I hang it up. I do that with every herb I grow. My son says that we decorate with food, and that is absolutely true. I dry our onions and garlic this way every year, and we don't have to buy that from the store either. And then when the garlic starts to sprout, I don't waste it. I take it down, I slice it, and I put it in the dehydrator and I grind it, and then I have my garlic powder for the next year, or onion powder. Beats the pants off anything you can buy. And all these things make great gifts too. For family members, it saves a lot of money. I mean, who doesn't like a jar of huckleberry jam or a jar of homegrown herb de Provence? Everyone loves that. Having all of this abundance in your own garden also decreases the amount of driving you have to do to buy your groceries. But also think of the bigger picture here. Think of the transportation costs of getting food to the stores in the first place. Growing your own food and eating it in season or preserving it for the off season means you're not buying strawberries that came from Mexico or peppers that came from South America. There are some things that we can justify buying from other countries, or maybe I just want to justify it, things like coffee and chocolate, really wonderful things. But as many things as we can get from our own gardens, the better. We're decreasing our total food miles. So I want you to think back for a minute to the spring and summer of 2020 and how we all were forced to stay at home and our world shrunk to the size of our houses and our available outdoor space. And I don't know about you, but I met more of my neighbors during that time than I ever have before because we were all out walking just to escape our four walls. An enormous amount of time for me back then was spent in my garden. It became my refuge and a very important part of my mental health. And really, it always has been. But COVID sharpened that awareness for me. Resilient urban spaces contribute to our mental and physical and emotional resilience by increasing our general health. We get physical activity in them, we get mental clarity in them, we get emotional renewal in them. And we found that being outdoors could also be one of the safest spaces we could be. How many of us had friends over to sit 6 feet apart in our gardens, or family over to sit on our patios and eat dinner? A resilient urban garden can be both things, a place where you can isolate if you want to, or be social if you want to, a place to meditate or pray or reflect, or to talk and laugh and share a meal. So that adds to our personal social resilience. And being in our gardens gives us a wonderful sense of place too, a connection to the way the natural world works that we don't get in our busy lives. We get so caught up in the newspapers or our social media feeds or our work schedules, the demands of the day. All of that's important for sure. But we also need to spend time in a place where we can fully disconnect from that noise and just be. Watch the yellow-faced bumblebees forage in the squash blossoms, get covered with pollen. Watch the goldfinches eat every single leaf off of my sunflowers. Listen to the red-shouldered hawks as they're hunting, and smell the lavender blooming. Feel the sun on our skin. Oh my gosh, I'll never take the sun for granted again after this winter. Or while resting under a tree, feeling the bark on our back. This gives us a very real sense of our place in time, in life. We see that nature has a cycle that goes on with or without us. A place where we can be out of doors, that's abundant, makes us better, healthier, more resilient people. And speaking of that cycle of nature, having this kind of outdoor space also increases habitat for wildlife of all kinds. I don't know if you've heard recently of all the studies that are coming out now of the enormous decline in the insect population. Some are calling it an apocalypse because once the insects crash, everything else crashes. Dr. Dave Goulson, he's in the UK, in his paper about the insect apocalypse and why it matters, he writes, the consequences are clear. Insects are integral to every terrestrial food web. And insects are not the only thing declining. Terrestrial vertebrate populations have decreased by 1/3. Half of all amphibians are imperiled, and bird numbers across North America have fallen by almost 3 billion since 1970. And there's really no sugarcoating. It's the loss of habitat that's mainly contributing to all of these declines. And urban places are often very difficult places for wildlife to live. But our urban gardens can be a refuge for all of those species. And yep, we want them all. We want the aphids too. In order to attract those desirable predators, we also need to be willing to host a lot of undesirable prey. And we can't forget about the biology that lives deep within the soil of our urban gardens. So much of our city space is concreted over or degraded soil or fouled in some way. The opportunity to create resilience within the soil is huge. Adding living plants, which convert sunlight to sugar and pump that down into the soil to attract life, is crucial and increases soil organic matter, which improves the tilth of the soil, which increases habitat for underground creatures. It's like this wonderful positive feedback loop. Gain, gain, gain in all of the best ways. This process literally regenerates the soil. And all that organic matter also helps retain water, which means that less is running off and into our oceans. All those impermeable spaces in urban yards, the concrete, the blacktop, the degraded soil, which allows water to just run off instead of infiltrate. All of that can be mitigated by improving the amount and quality of soil organic matter using the roots of plants and compost made from your food scraps and plant matter and mulch. This increases the resiliency of our water supply too, because we're using less municipal water. We're holding on to the water that comes from the sky. We hold it in our soils. This sort of green urban resilience provides a kind of stacked benefit where one intervention leads to many benefits. And speaking of stacked benefits for our own personal resilience, think about some other advantages that come from having an abundant green urban space. We can use our gardens to lower temperatures and filter both air and noise pollution. This is my west-facing garden. It gets incredibly hot in the summer directly into these windows. And I can't tell you how much money it saves to have it would save, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, to have a deciduous tree, which is fully leafed in summer, providing all that shade. And then in the winter, if we plan correctly, allows for that sunlight to come in and warm the home. And studies show that plants can filter up to 27% of the pollution drifting by from nearby roads and freeways. I'm less than a mile from 680, so that's important to me. And since plants use CO2 for photosynthesis and produce oxygen as a byproduct, our breathing is also improved. Studies show also that city noise can be reduced by up to 50% when vegetation is increased from minimal to moderate planting densities. So when we have this chaotic mess of plants, we're also helping to reduce noise. And as we start to increase the resilient effects of our urban gardens from a personal level to a community level, well, these benefits only increase. We've all heard the phrase urban heat island, yes? This occurs when cities replace natural land cover with dense concentrations of pavement and buildings and other surfaces that absorb and retain heat. One way to mitigate the effects of this is to plant dense green spaces. Several studies have shown that even smaller spaces, if planted densely with different levels of plants, can have an enormously cooling effect. Small trees provide shade, which shields the understory from solar radiation and regulates internal temperature by evapotranspiration. And a small standalone woodland can also generate its own microclimate by creating windbreaking and cloistering effects. All of this increases the city's resilience in the face of greater warming due to climate change. With greater warming, as we've seen, there's greater moisture in the atmosphere. So this increases the chance of heavy rain events. In cities, impermeable surfaces are everywhere. And with heavier rain, there's also a greater chance of flooding. One way to mitigate this is through green spaces. And studies show that, in fact, this is really interesting, a greater number of smaller patches of green spaces dispersed throughout the city is actually better at reducing flooding than in large separate areas. And this is great news for cities because they often don't have access to larger areas. So think about this patchwork, a patchwork of gardens hopscotching across a city. This could be ideal to reduce flooding, the flooding that's happening more frequently with climate change. And speaking of hopscotching, let's talk about wildlife again for a second. So I want you to imagine you're a honeybee. Your job is to find pollen and nectar to bring back to your colony. You can fly up to 5 miles to get it, but you'd much prefer it, and it would be much more efficient, and your chances of surviving the trip will be much greater if that pollen was within a mile of your home. So you fly through this densely packed city block, and all you see is concrete, and you fly on further. Concrete, further still, concrete, finally, Hooray, a yard with some dandelions, phew. I think it would be great. Imagine instead if every few feet as a bee you came across another densely planted garden, which increases your efficiency by allowing you to collect more in a shorter distance. And it helps your colony survive times of greater stress. In other words, become more resilient by increasing the amount of the diversity in your diet from all these different plants in these yards. Or another example, you're a monarch butterfly trying to make your annual migration. If there was some appropriately native milkweed available every other house, or heck, every other block, we wouldn't be having the monarch problem that we're having right now. These densely planted urban spaces also allow for cooler sidewalks and pleasanter pathways for humans to walk on. If you need to run an errand and it's a hot afternoon, you're more likely to drive that couple blocks than you are to walk if you have to walk on a hot concrete surface without any shade. But if there are gardens instead with lovely trees and planting, you're more likely to walk and enjoy the journey. And guess what? There's another positive feedback loop. If you walk more, you become healthier. If you're healthier, you're likely to be happier and perhaps even more resilient. And what about using these spaces as teaching opportunities? Kids are growing up increasingly disconnected from nature. Much of their lives, especially lately, has been spent inside using other kinds of connections. And again, who can blame them or blame their parents if there isn't access to a pleasant place to play outside? The advantages of playing in an outdoor space are many, according to Harvard Medical School. And we've already talked about the advantages of physical activity, but kids need unstructured time outdoors to learn executive functioning skills, planning, prioritizing, multitasking, negotiating. Being outdoors increases immune function, which makes kids more resilient. And they also need to take some risks. And being outdoors creates opportunities to climb trees or get stung by a wasp. And I think maybe the most important thing is if a child never grows up walking in nature, digging in the soil, seeing animals in their habitat, or playing in a stream of water, they never really understand what's being lost in a world that's changing so rapidly. And the future of our planet depends on young people, and they need to learn how to appreciate it at a very young age. In my own garden, I haven't done everything I could. There are areas where I could absolutely improve this, but I have created areas designed to stop children as they walk to school or to the neighborhood pool. My own kids made a little free library and they covered it with beautiful paintings, and there's always something interesting in there to look at. And in another spot, I started a fairy garden. It has a miniature cottage and a little wheelbarrow and pots of plants and fairies peeking out. And I have a crazy passion vine that is always covered with caterpillars, Gulf fritillary caterpillars. And that is an interesting place for kids to stop and look. My neighbors who also have chickens, they decided to keep their chickens in the front yard. And so you wouldn't believe the amount of people that come by just to see those chickens. They're silkies with fluffy feet. They're super cute. And if I'm in the garden, anytime a kid stops to look at these things, I make it a point to stop whatever I'm doing, if I can, and talk to them and ask them what they're experiencing and what they are learning. This increases our sense of community. And a community that knows each other and helps each other is more resilient. There are lots of ways that urban green spaces can help build a connection to our neighbors. Extra produce can be sold or given away or traded at crop swaps. Extra seed can be similarly swapped or traded. Tasting parties could be organized so that everyone can try new foods. If these sorts of connections are formed in times of abundance, the bonds will be helpful in times of want or need. And this is also increasing the food security of the entire neighborhood. We can expand that even more by giving away any extra fruit or produce to local food banks. Now, this is tricky. Large food banks often require knowing how much you're going to give them and when. They need that kind of dependable system. Farming's not always that predictable. But smaller organizations like churches or schools, they're happy to take whatever extra you have. Our garden at the Environmental Center has produced enough of certain things like kale and chard and spinach and beans and yes, zucchini, to be able to take extra to the Merritt Soul Food Pantry on campus. And that's so rewarding for my students and for me. So we can clearly see that there are myriad benefits to having resilient green spaces in cities, but it is true that not all city residents have the same access, geographically or historically, to nearby green spaces. A 2018 meta-analysis of the relationship between urban forests and income showed that there's a demonstrated and robust pattern between income and urban forest cover. That is, higher income has higher forest cover. And on public land, race-based inequity is also higher. Private residences with yards and tree-lined streets are more common in predominantly white neighborhoods. This is a form of environmental injustice. And let me be clear, environmental injustice is not sustainable and it is not resilient. Experts suggest that public green spaces at least should be intentionally designed to meet the needs of the community where it resides and what the community has identified, so that residents can be comfortable using them. A design strategy like this requires engagement and dialogue between communities and leaders. There's a need to recognize systemic issues with deep historical roots that can shape people's experiences with public lands, issues such as safety or feeling welcome. Now, that's a larger scale issue. It's one we aren't going to tackle here tonight. However, we can definitely work towards increasing equity in our own neighborhoods by creating resilient spaces that can be shared by everyone in our community. And finally, we can increase resilience on a global scale by creating resilient urban spaces. How is this possible? I just want to say that I took this picture last July in Lassen, right outside of Lassen Park. My husband and I went up to hike, and this was where the Dixie Fire moved through. And so there's enormous swaths of burned trees, and then there's places where the fire never touched. It's actually quite striking and sad. Well, we've already talked about all the stacked benefits provided by resilient urban spaces. They increase soil, carbon sequestration, decrease air and noise pollution, provide pollination and ecosystem services, reduce flooding, increase food security, provide respite, build community spirit. And the more people that participate in that backyard resilience, the more improvements become available for everyone. It compounds like interest. Those benefits, if repeated by many of us, can have a global impact. Our small personal actions in our gardens and our yards are often noticed and admired and repeated by others. Resilient neighborhoods often reside in resilient cities because the people living there see the benefits and they want to scale them up. This is called an ambition loop. When a city's economy improves, this spurs ambition from larger civic organizations and small governmental systems, and up the line, businesses, investors, cities, regions jump out ahead, leading governments to raise their targets, in turn allowing the private sector to go further and faster, and so on. They begin to see that we can minimize future losses, like this forest, and damages by investing in climate resilience and ensuring that the most vulnerable can recover more rapidly from extreme events. This leads to exciting change. There's already something called a Global Resilience Index, which provides data to businesses so they can determine the best places in the country to set up shop. Cities that are more resilient to climate change will simply attract more business. And when you bring money into the equation, it becomes of interest to everyone, and especially governments. Think about how much our government spends on the after effects of huge climate events. I'm thinking about Pajaro, the city in the Central Valley that recently flooded when the levee broke. The cost to clean up afterwards is far more than the cost to fix that levee in the first place. And when you think about the personal cost for all of those families, that can't be quantified. Think about that insurance industry. If there's an increase if there's a way to increase resilience in advance, from an economic standpoint, that could be very attractive. The United Nations has a global resilience project which aims to shift the focus of governments to investing in upfront measures that reduce disaster risk, rather than post-disaster relief and recovery efforts. Economics are not very sexy to talk about, but money often drives change faster than anything else. Now, just to bring it back more personally, becoming more resilient isn't a goal that's ever finished. It's a lifetime's work. It's a journey. It's an ever-changing and shifting point in the distance. And we can look at this as a frustrating fact, or we can look at this as an exciting one. And I prefer, I guess no surprise, the latter. Change is hard, but it's also exciting and fun. We get to take a look at our own urban spaces with fresh eyes and determine what needs tweaking. So over the last few years, I've been assessing my garden with an increasingly critical eye, and I zeroed in on a couple of things that we can do to change and become more resilient. The first might seem silly or maybe tragic. It's this southern magnolia tree. It's on that southwest side of the garden. It was planted here, I think, when the house was built in 1949. It has some significant pluses. It's lovely. For one, it provides a lot of shade, but it hails from wetter climes. My daughter goes to college in Georgia. That's where these belong. It's really suffering, or it was suffering, from a lack of water here. It looks great right now after all this rain. But it drops its leaves constantly, and you know they're thick and leathery. They never break down. They make an impenetrable ground cover. I put them for the chickens to scratch up sometimes, and sometimes they can't even do it. This tree sucks up all of the irrigation that I have around it, which is providing more drought tolerant, more resilient plants and food plants for our own use. It's taking water away from those things. Those food plants are suffering. And it's in this spot, which is south facing, which would much more benefit from a deciduous tree. So I'm thinking about removing this tree. Now, I had the guys to trim all of our big trees this past fall, and I could not pull the trigger. It's still there. So maybe that's something that I can change in the next time they come. However, the other part of the garden that I looked at with a critical eye and changed, and actually did change, is this other side that you see here. This is actually counterintuitively the north side of our garden, which has the worst hot, direct sun all summer, a long period of hot, direct sun. And, you know, for years, things in the summer here just were doing excellently. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, they just pumped out so much produce. It was wonderful. The last 3 years, it's just not happening. The tomatoes never ripen. It's too hot to even set fruit. You can see that I've made like 3 million different herky shade cloth things to try and help. That hasn't helped. Adding more of my own compost, that hasn't helped. Even using additional water hasn't helped, and that's not resilient and not sustainable. And then I had to plant and replant when the plants failed. That's not resilient or sustainable. So I decided it was time to do something in this area. And what I decided to do was plant an orchard here instead. I started this process in December. And when I removed these beds, I practice no dig, but I decided to do some digging and see what was underneath the surface. And I found so many roots from the Japanese pine tree that the neighbors have next door, right on the other side of the fence. They don't water. That Japanese pine tree needs water. So it has very cleverly snaked all of its roots over here, and it was stealing all of this water from my own plants. So not only were they having hotter days, there are days when it gets up to 115 in this part of the yard, easily, more days than I like to think about. Not only were they having hotter days, they were also getting their water stolen. So I was doubly glad that I decided to change this area. So we decided to grow this orchard. Fruit and nut trees will be much more able to compete with those tree roots than annual plants, and maybe even be able to form some fungal associations with them. I have several mature fruit trees here, which are doing excellently. So we worked on this new project over the last few months. In between storms, we have 100% clay soil, digging the posts for a new fence. We decided to do the new chicken fence at the same time. Not easy. We added 11 fruit trees here. It looks really bare right now, but I'm excited to see what happens. This will provide several benefits. The trees will use less water than annual vegetables. They're perennial, so less water, but also less ground disturbance because I'm not going to be digging something up 2 or 3 times a year. They'll provide abundant harvest for fresh eating and for preserving. They're going to grow into a canopy to create shade, not just for the people on the patio who want to eat their dinners outside in the summertime, but also for the chickens who need some shade. And they'll provide nectar and pollen for insects. And they'll block strong winds and noise and pollution. I'm really happy with this decision. And I would encourage you to go through the same process with your own urban spaces. Try to just open your eyes to something new and think about what you could change. It may not work, but it might. And that's really exciting. We can provide more resiliency in our yards. So to sum up, yes, we can use our urban spaces to create resilience. This is what we know. Urbanization results in an increasing proportion of the population living in cities. Urban living limits access to nature and can increase exposure to environmental hazards. Urban areas face increasing pressure from expanded populations, limited resources, and the growing impacts of climate change. These challenges must be addressed in order for cities to provide healthy and sustainable living environments for people. Green spaces can increase the quality of urban spaces, enhance personal and local and global resilience, and improve the health and well-being of its residents. It's vital that we work to ensure that public green spaces are easily accessible for all population groups and are distributed equitably within cities. In the meantime, we gardeners and farmers can do our part to increase resilience by creating abundant, alive, rich green spaces in our urban gardens. If enough of us do this, we can impact the health and the resilience for ourselves and for our families and our neighbors and our communities and maybe even our world. So let's get going, shall we? And here are my references. If anybody would like those, I'm happy to email them. Are there any questions?
Keenan, do you want to read some of the questions in the chat?
Sure, of course. We had a question earlier in the presentation. Mentioned that chain link fence is not good as a wooden fence when growing plants. It keeps the neighbor's weeds and plants from encroaching, but would allow more sunlight. So just what are your takes on chain links versus wooden fences?
Well, my personal preference is that we wouldn't have fences at all, honestly. But we also have deer, and my fence is for the deer. Plain and simple. Well, first it was to keep my kids inside the yard and not in the busy street. But now my fence is for the deer. I don't really think of it so much as a privacy thing. Chain link, the only reason I was opposed to the chain link was that it was ugly. I think it's ugly. And we were very lucky. We were really lucky actually, because when we moved in, so the chain link wasn't around the entire yard, it was only on part of the yard, and we wanted to be able to have the kids use the entire yard. And so my parents very generously made that a gift to us, a wooden fence, when we moved in. If they hadn't have done that, then it would have stayed chain link until we could do it ourselves, which would have taken a long time. So I'm not opposed to chain link, especially if you grow something beautiful. At the environmental center, we decided to use the chain link fence to espalier fruit trees. So the fruit trees are all against it, and they'll be espaliate against it, and it will create this beautiful living fence. There's also a grape arbor against one chain link fence. So they can be beautiful if I just like things pretty.
Right. Next question that I have. What impact does urban nighttime lighting have on pollinators?
Ooh,
And how can excessive lighting be dealt with?
this is something I've been wanting to talk to my neighbors about, and I don't really know how to broach it. Many of my neighbors leave their lights on all night long, and I realize it's a safety issue. And if it is a safety issue, what I think would be, so first of all, nighttime lights are completely changing the habits of pollinators. It attracts them, it interrupts their cycles. They need dark, just like we need dark, they need dark. It interrupts all these circadian rhythms that they have, and it's causing everything to go a little haywire. And it's also dangerous for them. Lights can kill them. So if you need a light for safety, have it on a what is it, like the movement, where when somebody walks across it, the light comes on. That's a much better option than having them on all the time. My neighbors have them on all the time. We don't use any lights at night. And outside.
Yes. Great. Ah,
All right. I think we have one more question in chat. Well, it's kind of a two-parter. They were looking to see if you can show the reference page again.
Oh, sure.
And then the second part of their question was, where's the environmental center that you mentioned? Is that at the Merritt College?
It's at Merritt College. You're welcome to come visit. Probably the best time to do that would be this summer, when I'll be there every day, because we do not have irrigation. So I have to hand water the entire farm. So I'll be there every day teaching and watering. And if you'd like to, I know that Patricia has my information. Please, Patricia, feel free to give out my personal email or my work email. It's on the Merritt campus, and it is completely hidden. It's just recently been put on a map. It used to be called the Self-Reliant Center, the Self-Reliant House, I think it was called, but it's now called the Environmental Center. And we're really proud of it. It is scrappy. That's what we like to say. It's scrappy.
Mm-hmm.
Work in progress.
I think that's it for the questions in chat, but if anybody's interested, you can always shout any questions out if you have any. I think Molly had your hand raised.
Yeah, do you do any kind of water gathering or rain catchment? Do you have any of those kind of systems?
Oh my gosh, my kingdom for those huge water tanks this winter, huh? Oh, I was so bummed that I didn't have the money to get those installed. That's what we need, are those big tanks. I have rain barrels. They're practically useless, in my opinion, because we get all of our rain at once, as you know. So the rain barrels fill up that first rain, and then it sits there all winter. And then the first day of summer that I want to water, I use everything in the rain barrels, and then it's empty, and then it's empty all summer. So it's good for one water. It's not a great solution. When we had our roof redone, we asked if there was a way to make, what I really wanted to do is make all the gutters kind of on a cant, on a tilt, so that all of the water would run down towards one area, and then I would invest in these, I don't really know where all this money's coming from, but I would invest in these big rain tanks, and then it would all go into that. And I've seen systems like that in Berkeley. Which I visited, I'll have to remember her name. There's someone in Berkeley that has this system, and they use it the tank water goes into their shower and then into their toilets. I mean, it's amazing. Like, all of this is amazing. But we're just not in a place right now where we can do that. This old house, in order to have the gutters made like that, they would have had to do structural work, and we just can't afford that. So my water catchment plan is organic matter. Every year, sometimes more than once, I get free wood chips from a tree company. I like Traverso Tree. They are really knowledgeable. I use them for my pruning and my wood chip needs. And on their website, they have a page where you can type in what where to put it in your yard or your driveway. If you're not there, they text you and call you first to see if you're okay. It's 20 cubic yards at once. It's a lot of wood chips. It's like a great workout plan. And I can tell you firsthand, we watched this winter, we had a creek break its banks and overflow and come down the street. And we have the only drain in front of our house for, I don't know, 2 blocks, because this is an old neighborhood, 1940s neighborhood. And all of that water came to the drain in the front. And our whole front garden, not a hair out of place. Those wood chips held all that water there. We didn't have any erosion. I didn't have soil leaving my property, nothing. So I really think having a living, and in fact, I'm going to be talking about this next week at the Berkeley Garden Club talk. I'll be talking about how to increase soil fertility. And if you keep a living root in the soil all the time, if you practice no dig as much as possible, if you're constantly adding organic matter, if you're covering your soil, that's the best way to hold water on your property. And it's free. Wood chips are free.
Elizabeth, does that hold true with the heavy clay soil that we have around here? Just top dressing is sufficient?
Well, yes. So I have literally 100% clay. We're under a stream bed here. Used to be a stream bed. And I've been doing this now for about 16 years. I've been adding organic matter to our soil. And the top foot is really gorgeous. But once you start digging a 2-foot hole for posts, wooden posts for a fence, then you find the clay layer again. And it is just as clayey as it was the day we moved in. So I think it's like, it takes so much time, right? But most of the stuff we're growing is really getting most of its nutrition and water from that top layer of soil. So, and that's where we're working most of the time. So I don't have any problem anymore. I did have problems for years. I used to dig a hole, take the clump, because it was like a rock, and put it in my compost. And then I would fill it in. And then after a while, I learned that was like the worst thing you could do, because plants need to get used to the soil you have. So then I would take that clod and I would bash it with a hammer and mix in some organic matter. I mean, I just worked at it for years. Now I just top dress all the time. Top dress, compost every time I put in a new crop, or every year if it's ornamental, mulch at least once a year, sometimes more.
There's some more good questions in the chat. Elizabeth, somebody is commenting, Anne, that she's noticed an overabundance of ants with wood chips. And she asks if you have suggestions for controlling them.
That's interesting. I'm noticing an abundance of ants right now because I think of the weather and because their homes are very wet. So the ants that we have here are Argentine ants. They are, for the most part, non-native Argentine ants. So if something is non-native and invasive, I think it's okay if you want to do a little control. I have found that I have not found more ants because of wood chips. I have ants no matter what. Whether there's wood chips or not, I've always had ants, lots and lots of ants. So I have taken to using diatomaceous earth, both around, I put it around my honeybee hive so that they don't climb up and get the honey. And I also put it around my, like a little line around my house. And that has really helped. And I get the good stuff. I get like the food grade diatomaceous earth. I don't know if that makes a difference. That's really helped. But if they start to come in the house, then sometimes I will use a drop of Terra or something inside for them to take back to their nests, because you're never going to eradicate the Argentine ants. It's one of those things that we're never going to get, we're never going to get rid of them. And they do some ecosystem services, but they're so invasive and there's so many of them that I think it's okay once in a while to to take a little action. Let's see, will the wood chips absorb the nitrogen from the soil in order to decompose? Yes, but only where they meet the soil, right at that interface, right between the wood chips and the soil. That's where that's happening. So as long as you're not mixing the wood chips in with your soil so that there's that interface all over the place, it should be okay. So you just keep it on the top and there's that one layer, and then they don't hurt the rest of the plants. Now, I don't use wood chips. I should say I don't use wood chips in my raised beds where I grow vegetables, because I'm always afraid with annuals, I'm often removing things and putting something else in, and those wood chips can get mixed in a lot. So in my raised beds, my preferred method of mulching is a living crop. So I plant so densely that there is no space and there is no light basically getting down underneath. It's just it's a green cover constantly. If I do need something, then I use hay or plants fava beans that I've chopped down, chop and drop. So not in my raised beds, but everywhere else. Anything we can do to counter that nitrogen? You don't need to, just keep it on the surface. Don't mix it in. Oh, Asian jumping worms. Doug, have you found them here? I didn't think they were here yet. Are they here now?
What is an Asian jumping worm? That sounds terrible.
I don't know if Doug's still here. Asian jumping worms are becoming a real problem. They're an invasive worm. First of all, did you know that all of our earthworms are not native? None of them are native. Most of them are not invasive though, and they're great. But Asian jumping worms are invasive and they're taking over the East Coast. And they eat so fast that forest floors are being eaten so fast they can't revitalize the areas of natural, plantings. So I don't know what we're going to do about it. That's a very new problem, and I didn't think they were here yet. Gosh, I hope they're not. Stay tuned. Oh, I see Diana. Diana, my neighbor, is on here. Yes, slow composting is still composting. Compost will happen even if it's cold and slow.
So Elizabeth, Diana gave a shout out about your honey. Where can people obtain that?
Only if you're my neighbor and I'm bribing.
Oh, I'm not moving to Walnut Creek, too hot.
Yeah, we only have one hive. When they swarm, if I can catch the swarm, I give them away to somebody who wants them, or I just let them go and find a new home. I only keep the one hive, and we don't harvest a lot. We don't use a lot. But I like to give it to the neighbors because sometimes the swarms land in their trees. And a lot of times people get very anxious about that. So that's one way to, I find fresh eggs and honey is a really good neighborly thing to do. Something jumping under the mulch when I uncovered it. Cricket? I don't know. I don't know. There are so many wee beasties when you push back the mulch and take a look. It's really fascinating. If you have a macro lens on your camera or on your phone, oh, it's so fun to take pictures of everything, but I'm not sure what that was jumping. Sorry, Doug, I don't know. Fleas, oh.
Well, we want to say thank you, Elizabeth, for speaking and for answering all of our questions. And I will say you've made me hopeful that after 50 years, I think I'd put enough ground dressing on to get rid of the clay, but I'm gonna keep at it.
Well, let me add that Elizabeth is also speaking at our Berkeley Garden Club meeting next Tuesday, the 18th of April. She'll be our program from 2 to 3. You are welcome to come as our guests. We meet at the Albany Community Center on Marin between Masonic and I think Evelyn. Well, it's on the corner of Masonic and Marin.
Right by the BART tracks.
Yep. We have a business meeting at 1:45. We break. We're going to have an informal tea at 1:45. And then Elizabeth is going to speak on soil and healthy soils at 2. The other thing that will, the talk, the recorded talk will be available through the Berkeley Garden Club website, and it's berkeleygardenclub.org. And we also, the Berkeley Garden Club is going to not only have a plant sale on May 6th, but we're going to have a garden tour on May 20th. And one of the gardens on the garden tour actually has a rainwater catchment. He has 3 large tanks. They're all full right now, but you'll have a chance to see how that water is collected. So that's May 20th, and all the information on the plant sale and the garden tour are on our website. So we invite you next Tuesday. We'd love to see you, and we'd love to see you at the plant sale and the garden tour also. So that's the Berkeley Garden Club commercial for the day.
And I've
Elizabeth.
also put it in the chat, both the plant sale and the garden tour, and I'm just putting it in again so you don't have to scroll all the way back up to the top.
Perfect. Oh, Elizabeth, this has been great. It's been great to meet you. I've heard so much about you, so thank you.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, I guess, Keenan, I think we can call it an evening.
All right. Well, hope everybody has a good rest of their evening,
Great.
and feel free to reach out to either Berkeley Garden Club or the Albany Senior or Community Center for more information.
Wonderful. Keenan, thank you. And Patricia, thank you as always.
Well, thank you, Beth and Keenan. Okay,
Good night, all.
good night.